And today's lecture will be examining Chapter 12 of the text concerning diversity in policing. So the history of increased hiring and what has ultimately become acceptance of non-white police officers has had a kind of a bumpy history throughout the 20th century, much like the struggles in larger society associated with the civil rights movement and other issues throughout the course of that time. A lot of that was mirrored in policing. So, as various areas of the United States were more or less accepting of issues of integration, equal rights, the areas that favored more heavily towards that, towards the acceptance, integration, equality, saw more more representation in their police forces. Other areas that didn't were resistant to that. Still, some of those areas still have those negative connotations, and we've seen a lot of that come out recently with the high-profile cases of police misconduct, and some of them are lining up with some of the areas that have yet to see representation in their police force of the community. A very stark example of that was in Ferguson, Missouri, where there were very, very few non-white police officers in that police force. Meanwhile, the community in that area was 60% African American. So the history has been rocky. And there was also the issue throughout this time period of the police department basically hiring officers, typically in very small numbers, to try and appease the community and their demands of representation, only to see their demands basically met with officers that were more or less consider themselves to be police officers before minority community members. So they either were resistant themselves to trying to change the department as a whole, or, which was probably more common, was that they were systematically unable to invoke any change. They weren't promoted, they weren't given positions of power or decision-making positions throughout the department. They were basically hired to be a appeasement to the community. When the community saw that there didn't actually have any kind of real representation in the police forces, that's when you started to see this double marginality, where the community members basically didn't feel like any of their needs or wants were being addressed, and their push to see the department higher just for the sake of appearances declined. Overall, during this time period, though, as far as the performance of the non-white police officers, there's no difference. There's no difference in, or I should say, there's no drop off in quality of service. There's no increases in crime. There's no decreases in services that are provided by the police department from these representative community members. So there's not really any reason why these individuals who were being hired shouldn't have been considered in the first place. The only thing that was holding any of these individuals back was the systematic racism existing in the United States, in the society, and in the criminal justice system itself. We see a very similar history of systematic exclusion of women in policing as well. Before the 1950s, 60s, 70s, depending on what part of the country you're talking about, we saw a lot of height restrictions for sworn officers. So they would hire women in policing to do secretarial work, non-sworn positions, but they wouldn't hire them to be police officers. And one of the ways that they prevented that from happening was having these systematically biased height requirements. Women on average are, I'm not sure, I think it's like 5'9" for men and 5'4" for women. So they're on average shorter than men in the United States. So by having a height requirement, and set low at that on that sort of curve for the height of women in this country, you're going to systematically exclude a lot of potential applicants just based on a characteristic which is not unimportant in policing and some of the physical aspects that they do, but not so much so that it should exclude anyone from service um, compared to other candidates. um, Once some of those restrictions were removed, and you started to see more women being hired into police forces, again, it's still like the issues with minority representation, it's not representative of the overall population. If that was the case, it would be half of the officers would be women, and that's not the case in any major police department that I'm aware of. There might be some smaller police departments where you only have 4 or 6 officers, and then if you have 2 female members or 3 female members, then don't make up half the force. But when talking about larger police forces in major urban areas, there's nowhere near the representation. But for those officers that were hired, they faced a lot of negative hazing, basically, in the police subculture, much the same way that the minority community members that were hired on the police forces faced. Sexual harassment was another aspect to early women police officers, still felt by officers today. Although the reporting, that being a major part of police subculture has been reduced, not eliminated, certainly. My mother was a police officer. My grandmother was a police officer. But my mother was not a police officer, was a emergency medical technician, an EMT. And she said that when she first got hired, that the male ambulance workers would walk around in the locker room naked in an attempt to try to intimidate. And things like that, things like having access to a private locker room, were things that had to come sort of piecemeal and as time went by for female officers. The conditions today are much better than they were 50 years ago, but they're still not anywhere near to equal in terms of representation, and also in terms of the treatment within these police organizations, in terms of reporting things like sexual harassment, and also having things like access to promotions, which again is an issue that's been faced by the minority community members as well. So for minority female police officers, they have to face sort of a double layer of all these issues. And again, to the issue of performance, there's been no measurable difference in the performance for male officers or female officers. There has actually been some studies that show that female officers are better in things like crisis intervention or crisis reduction, dealing with mental health issues, a lower uses of force levels, and lower force used when force does have to be used. Excuse me. There is the idea or notion that because the female officers are typically smaller in physical stature compared to the males, get back to the height requirement issue, they'd be less competent in physical altercations. And that's not the case when you have trained officers that can engage in hand-to-hand combat from a competent level. If you've ever seen videos on like Fail Army or World Star of people fighting, you can usually tell really quick whether or not any of the people in the fight know how to fight, because a real fight is going to be over very quickly. And when you have people that are going up there and just slap fisting, flailing their arms around, that's not any sort of trained combatant. So if you give officers, smaller in stature, whether they're male or female, if you give them the necessary tools to protect themselves and protect the people around them, in terms of hand-to-hand training, they can be very competent in a fight, even against a larger combatant, especially if that combatant doesn't know what the hell they're doing. Usually a fight between a person that doesn't know how to fight and someone that does is over extremely quickly, usually in one punch, just because the untrained person, may have seen fights on television, but it's a whole different thing when it actually happens. To try to address the systematic issues associated with some of these demographic makeups of police forces. There have been implementation of affirmative action programs. Um, the majority of the actual formal programs that have been enacted have been done so unwillingly or been court ordered. Um, the department wasn't trying to fix themselves. They were basically told to fix their operation and what they were doing. Um, they're When departments try to hire more minority members, they're fairly successful in doing so. Um, the issue, the main issue comes for those individuals that get hired is that they face resistance from the members that are already there, and they also face a limited access to promotion. There was a big issue in Atlanta recently, maybe about a year and a half ago. The police chief wanted to take off, and the mayor also wanted to take off a question asking about minor drug use, typically marijuana use, on the application, on the early form application, um, because that question excluded a lot of candidates from moving forward in the process, and didn't really give the applicants a chance to um, contextually address what the nature of the use was. And that's something that they felt would be better dealt with in a interview down the road if they did find the person to be a suitable candidate for the police force, that they would handle that on a case-by-case basis down the road. The officers that had already been hired under the old policy were like, well, what the hell are you doing? You're going to fill the department with a bunch of potheads. So there was resistance to any kind of change or reduction in the standards as they saw them for being a police officer. But there wasn't any sort of again, no difference in the work that those officers performed while they were working. The ones that are hired under an affirmative action scenario, it might not be the best formal policy to put into place because you open yourself up to criticism and things like that. But it has been effective where it's been implemented in bringing more minority community members onto the police forces. um, Another thing to address the issue of promotion, and really to address the affirmative action issue kind of indirectly, is relying exclusively on a civil service system for hiring and promotion. And in that case, they try to give everyone as equal an opportunity as possible and just look at merit. You're hired based on merit, qualifications for the job, and you're promoted as such as well. There is still the sort of political stink that goes along with the operation of a large urban police department, and it's almost unavoidable to have the influence from the political system on the police department. But the implementation and the utilization of a civil service system can at least make the playing field, while it might not be fair, at least more uniform and predictable. So that's one way that's been used to try to slowly direct the police departments towards a more representative makeup. Going forward, the numbers are changing, but they're not changing necessarily as fast as they should. Depending on the social environment of an area, that's going to play into the representation for those police forces. So cities like Atlanta, Los Angeles, Detroit, they have become more representative in the last 30 to 40 years of the citizens they represent in terms of their racial makeup, but also in terms of female officer inclusion on the department. But no place is really as representative as the area. Nothing really lines up directly. Again, in these major forces, there's always something lacking in what their ability to hire and also to promote has been. There's still a lack of female executives in police forces, and in a lot of areas, there's a lack of minority representation in those forces as well. Part of that is the hiring, the departments that hired minority members, community members, and hired female officers in the past have had a longer time for those individuals to advance their position in those departments. But it also plays into who are you laterally hiring? Who are you hiring from outside the department to come in and potentially be a new executive for your department? Or who are you bringing in as a chief? Those things are all very important and need to be addressed going forward. Again, the civil service system, um, not just hiring or promoting someone based on their legacy and the family history in the department, but based on what they're doing today, what they've done in the past year, what they've done with their time in the department, and how that has impacted the city in which they live in. um, we've also seen a lot of departments sort of dragging their feet with the issue of LBGT officers, in much the same way that we saw it for minority community members and we saw it for female officers. They're basically one of the last remaining others for the police force. A group of individuals that is um, mislabeled, that is potentially misunderstood or systematically ostracized by police culture. There are some departments that are better about this, that have outreach with the community leaders, have officers on the force, not just those officers on the force. It's like putting the all black officers in the predominantly black neighborhoods. You don't want to just have LBGT officers the only ones interacting with those communities, because it didn't really promote success in the past on racial lines. It's not going to do the same thing with sexual orientation, gender identity lines. So you have to have those officers sort of integrate themselves within the department, within the executives, and we've seen a resistance to that. Some resistance silent, some more vocal, to that, to the inclusion of these officers in the department and in the police subculture. So we really need to take lessons from the past and the changes that have taken place um, through the incorporation of minority community members, through the incorporation of more female officers, um, as this is the next sort of hurdle that the police departments have to get over, and have to work past to become inclusive representations of the community, because that is one of the most important things to having legitimacy within the community, is being representative of that community. So that's the section covering diversity in police forces, and the short answer is that it's gotten better, but it doesn't. The police culture as a whole doesn't need to be complacent on the small measure of victory that they've had, becoming slightly more representative for on some fronts, but being resistant on others. So we need to take the lessons that we've learned from the past and apply them to bettering these departments in the future.